Ben Shapiro, how are you?
Thank God, doing okay. How are you?
Jet lag?
Lot jet lag, yeah.
Yeah, they say there's this thing called Ben After the Dark.
And after dark, yeah, and that's when I'm tired, you get more honest answers. So prepare yourself. Yeah,
Okay. What do you think about Trump? You like him.
I like trying. That's not. That wasn't. That's not a good one. Yeah, you didn't go for it. You got to go for it. Even now, the opportunity has passed you by. Right?
Huge event at the White House. Potential deal, 20 point or 21 point, depending on what site you read. Plan for the Middle East.
Yes.
What do you think?
I mean, frankly, I think that it's a diplomatic triumph for both President Trump and for Prime Minister Netanyahu. For President Trump, being able to somehow get Israel and Qatar and Saudi and the Spanish and the French and Brits all on the same page and oriented against Hamas is an amazing thing. And for Trump and Netanyahu to be able to do so while maintaining Israel's core interest, meaning no security threat from Gaza, meaning really no future Palestinian state unless the Palestinian Authority were somehow to jump through hoops that we all know they're nearly impossible. But they jump through Erdogan. Erdogan's on the same kick. So what they somehow done, this is again is a tribute to President Trump and his negotiating team. What they've somehow done is oriented everyone against Hamas. So now if Hamas says no to the deal, Israel essentially has carte blanche to finish the job. Now, obviously, it'd be better if the deal gets done so the hostages get out. If the deal does not get done, then presumably Hamas will continue to stash the hostages around the Gaza Strip. But the rest of the deal will go through whether or not Hamas acquiesces or not.
So it's interesting. This morning, someone texted me, one of my reporters, saying that there's no clause within this plan, which is not a final plan, right? I think it's pretty much a roadmap. Like what, for instance, right? You're in the middle of this, release, and then Hamas they sent a missile towards Israel.
Right.
There was nothing there. Like, okay, what happens then?
Right. So things like. Well, and the Prime Minister, even in the middle of the press conference, actually, I think tried to handle that. There was one point where he actually said, if Hamas were to agree and then delay or break the deal, then we would go back to status quo ante. So I think Israel's already making provision for that, and President Trump was not going to be particularly tolerant of that. If Hamas launches one rocket or something, then you might see him say, well, the deal still. He did this, you remember, at the very tail end of the Iran war, right? The ceasefire that was and then there was a big build the base, get the rain, they turn around. Exactly. So you could see something similar happen there. But if Hamas were to full out fire a flurry of rockets into Sderot or something, then I don't think you're going to see the president get upset with Israel for going in and finishing off whatever remnants of Hamas were firing those rockets.
Yeah.
So again, I think this is about as good a conclusion as you could have wanted if you are Israeli or American. You just want to get to the end of this thing. And it does set the groundwork for future relations with other nations in the region, which is hard. That's really fascinating. Yeah, it really is. And I think that, again, that's a testimonial to the negotiating stamina of the Israelis, of the Americans, and also the fact that the Prime Minister's office works really well with the President's office on this sort of stuff.
They really saw eye to eye, and some people were saying it may have an Israeli plan or adapted or changed by the Trump staff or whatever. But
I mean, I think it was definitely meeting the minds. If what I understand from people who are in the room from sort of both sides, it was not as though everybody sat down and this was the first draft.
I think one issue that many people in Israel and also many of our readers in the United States are interested in dwelling is Charlie Kirk. You guys were close. I think you said in an interview somewhere that you were the last person he interviewed, possibly.
Yeah, but believe I'm sure I was. Sebastian, his slash show we were on. The thing about Charlie is that he was ubiquitous. So he was texting with an enormous number of people. So in the last week of his life, he was texting with pretty much everybody that I knew personally and sort of in the business, and that's how Charlie was. When I say that I was, when I say I was close with Charlie, I was very friendly with Charlie, but I was like in his inner circle of friends. I knew Charlie from the time he was 18 years old. So I knew him for 13 years before his murder. And we used to speak relatively frequently.
So it's interesting. So I saw this podcast you're on where you were saying how he was 31 and you said I'm 40 on, and you were like, whoa, the nice age gap. Yeah. But you guys are in a similar niche of you were going on campuses for years or still, right? Debating.
Mm-hmm.
And he's doing it from a similar but a different direction from the more Christian element. Well, I mean, you don't necessarily go in a religious element, though you are.
But if I'm asked about it, then I'll talk about my religion, obviously. And opinions part of that. Yes, I mean, I will say that if you watch Charlie's, then these things are like 3 hours long. If you watch Charlie's, kind of large-scale debates, the vast majority of them had nothing to do with religion.
Okay.
And he infuses his religion into his worldview the same way that I would or many people would. He's obviously very openly religious, but I think that it would be an overstatement to say that his events or TPUSA itself was a predominantly Christian outreach organization. It was a political outreach organization that had a heavy Christian bent because Charlie
Right.
is obviously a very religious Christian.
Right. And so it was interesting in that interview you were saying the young lady asked you what people should learn from Charlie. What do you think America should be doing now? You said go to church, and she said, but you're Jewish, and you said America is a Christian country. Which, I find it interesting, because, some people see the Jews as like this big majority, but we're a minority, right?
Well, the number of Jews in the United States is approximately 6.5 million at this rate. So it's a very small population inside the United States. When I said that America is a Christian country, I mean that all the founders were either deists or Christians. They were drawing on a 2,000-year Christian tradition that has originally, of course, Judaic roots, but it's a Christian country, and so pretend otherwise is both dishonest and counterproductive because you need more people going to church because people who go to church in America tend to engage with a biblical morality that I think is valuable to the world.
Lions of the Scavengers, new book, the true story of America. Was Charlie a lion?
Yes, I mean, so the basic principles of the Lion of the Scavenger that it's in if you're a Jew, you basically see it Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Tov. I mean, that's sort of the basic principle. That when you are everybody has within them two competing forces. One that gets up in the morning and says, how do I build? How do I make the world a better place? I have problems in my life. Have I face up to those problems and deal with that in a responsible, dutiful way? And then there's part of you that looks at the problems around you and say, well, all of that is everybody else's fault. And how do I complain about those systems? And then how do I tear down all of the institutions that surround me that are responsible for the individual problems in my life? And that can be sort of abstracted out to groups. It can be abstracted out to political philosophies. And so, these sort of lions are people who, again, wish to engage responsibly with the world, who want to maintain institutions worth preserving, but change the ones that actually need change.
But are they essentially conservative or not?
No, it doesn't have to be a conservative. Okay, so I would say that there are people who disagree with me on tax rates, for example, marginal tax rates, who are people who effectively want to build things that are good, who wish to approach the world in a responsible way.
Okay.
And then there are people who would consider themselves on my side politically, who are very much focused on tearing pretty much everything down and see the world as a place that is filled with conspiratorial forces that need to be destroyed. And so one of the big things I talk about in Lions and Scavengers is this idea of the great conspiracy theory, this idea that the world is conspiring against you to harm you. And so that means that you must act with violence against that conspiracy. You must tear down that conspiracy. That mentality exists on both left and right. That's not unique to the left. I think it's more heavily identified with the left, but there's certainly people, again, who will agree with me on policy as a general matter who wouldn't necessarily fall in the lion category.
Right. There's this cancel culture, I think, on both sides, in a sense, right? You have the extremes, extreme left, extreme right, who will not agree to any other opinion but their own. And I think that's maybe one of the things also, like, Charlie was speaking, it was trying to promote, and you try to promote is let's talk, right? Well, sometimes there'll be someone who'll be like, oh, I won't do an interview in your newspaper. You're like, why? Like, oh, because you guys are so-and-so, right? And like, okay, but like, if you believe in what you have to put to say, what do you care?
Yeah, I mean, we'll say, well, freedom of mind is definitely one of the central principles that I talk about. Like, there are certain kind of societal principles that need to govern in a successful society of lions, like all fried and the Bima. And those are things that include things like private property, equal rights before the law, freedom of mind, and traditional virtue and insert your own life. If you're not doing those things as a society, then you're failing. But yes, I mean, I think that you can read cancel culture too broadly, meaning that no one should ever say anything bad about you because it's mean, and that actually becomes sort of weird countervailing cancel culture, where some people say something terrible and then they'll get feedback. They'll say, you're canceling me. It's like, no, that's not cancellation.
Right.
And also, cancel culture doesn't mean that there's no such thing as a truly awful opinion. There are many, many truly awful opinions. Okay, it really don't deserve the time of day. But I think that the idea of cancel culture originally was that the predominantly the left had closed the Overton window, the area of acceptable conversation so tightly that mainstream normie opinions, like men are not women, would get banned from social media, or you'd get fired from your job for saying that sort of thing. That's not quite the same thing as saying there should be social consequences for rooting for the Nazis, or there should be social consequences for standing for Hamas or something.
Right. It was interesting, actually. I wasn't planning this question, but you lit a torch, right, on Mount Herzl, which is a big deal in Israel. People, outsiders of vote, don't get it. And there was was a bit of demonstrations against you, saying, not physical demonstration, but like saying he's against gay rights or against
Gay marriage or gay marriage or a lot of mischaracterization from some of the other.
right. Also saying, if I understand correctly, right, it's not being against people who are gay. It's about the way the discussion is held,
Right, but I mean,
or also the forcefulness of it.
yeah, well, I mean, I think that some of it was just direct mischaracterization, people attributing beliefs that I don't hold to me.
Right.
But
It's very easy to get a sound bite.
oh, right, or to simply make stuff up, which is what happened in some cases.
Okay.
But some of it was, I am not in favor of same-sex marriage as a societal governmental policy. Right, that does not mean the government should be breaking people's bedrooms and policing their sexual activity, but the idea the government should be rewarding particular types of living arrangements with tax breaks or specific regulation. The case that I've made is that a society really only has an incentive, or should only have an incentive, for a man to marry a woman and have children, because that's what society actually has an interest in. However you order your own personal life, really, that do we reward everyone else through Europe, and then right. I mean, so and somehow the fact that became a sort of bizarre controversy is that people who are looking for controversy
Right.
at this point. Also, I mean, last I checked, the law in the state of Israel, it will respect marriages performed outside the state of Israel, but I don't believe that there's any provision in law in the state of Israel for same-sex marriages directly.
Right.
So,
I mean, there's about interesting news article we published about the flotilla on the way to Gaza, and I think I forgot it was Greta or other people who had to go on a different flotilla because of arguments about LGBT rights and stuff like that. Because there was like a rift between that. That's hilarious. And someone said just let them go to Gaza, right?
yeah,
We'll get off the boat, and then
they're even having breakaway minyanim on the flotilla.
okay.
Well, then.
So speaking of the lions and the scavengers, is there anyone that you would not, in your profession, is there someone you would not interview or not meet?
And there are many people, but I don't feel an obligation to.
Not an obligation, but like you would.
Advocates for violence.
Okay.
I mean, there are people who actively advocated violence, and so I would feel the necessity to have dialogue,
Or to give them a platform.
right. And I think that that's true for everybody has their limits.
Right.
And so I'm not a person who has ever believed that I owe it or I have some sort of moral obligation, forget legal obligation, I understand, but like a moral obligation to sit down with anybody and everybody. Your life is only so many breaths. The question is, how many productive conversations do you want to have with those breaths? And some conversations are not productive. And again, I'm not calling for these people to be regulated or legally prosecuted or something, but I certainly get to make the decision in my own life about whether it's productive for me to sit down across the table from somebody who has advocated for violence or who has suggested that Islamic terrorism is fine or whatever.
Right. But like, I don't know, it would be like, I don't know, a head of a state that's, a state that's very anti-Jewish. I mean, would you?
I mean, well, again, that goes to sort of the productivity of the conversation. So sometimes you want to do those sorts of conversations because you're looking for clarification.
Okay.
Anybody have a chance to actually ask somebody?
Right. Not in a fluff interview.
Right. I would.
So do you do fluff interviews?
They're obviously people I'm more politically aligned with, and so it comes off as a fluff interview. But when I sat down with Vladimir Zelensky, by the way, and I'm very sympathetic to the Ukraine, because I did a full hour where I just asked him questions that many people on the right were asking about Ukraine, including was it corruption or being pulled into the military off the street, and this stuff like that.
Right.
And what's irritating to me for sure is when people have the opportunity to ask leaders that sort of stuff, and they're not openly. Like, I'm an opinion person, so that means that I know shopper.
I haven't.
So that means that I'm going to be much more aligned. If I'm interviewing Prime Minister Netanyahu or Javier Milei, I'm much more aligned with their point of view than I would with Vladimir Putin. So it's natural that I would ask more difficult questions of Vladimir Putin because I agree more with a Bibi or Milei.
Right.
But again, I think that if you have the opportunity to sit with, say, the president of Iran.
Okay.
And you proceed to ask only soft questions to the president of Iran.
Right. At the very least, that's well. Would you interview the president of Iran?
Sure. I guess I'm asking very specific questions to ask the president of Iran. Sure.
Like what?
Like, why won't you allow women in your country basic human dignity and rights? Like, why do you insist on building a nuclear program in a country that is oil and natural gas rich? Like, why don't we have real elections in your country?
Okay.
Like, wouldn't it be better for your people if you actually allowed them to flourish economically and societally, even within an Islamic context? Because it's not as though you have to ditch Islam in order to do any of those things, or is it just about power for you? I mean, like, these are very specific questions.
Mhm.
Why do you support terrorism outside your borders? Why are you developing a ballistic missile program capable of hitting Europe? Like, these are all pretty specific.
Lots of big questions. Okay. I interviewed you many years ago for a different newspaper I was working at, and it was about, I did a series of interviews with American Jews and Israelis about the relationship between Israel and the Jewish community in America, which was, it was around the whole Kotel deal and stuff like that. And then, there was talks of people saying, oh, there's a rift between Israel and the U.S. And you were very opinionated, as you mentioned, about the progressive and the reformed Jewish community. Yes, religiously reformed in the U.S. Do you feel that anything? I mean, do you see anything that has changed since October 7th?
There's some. I mean, I see of course. There's some Jews who would identify as reform or conservative, mugged by reality for sure. I mean, I get calls from them, people who are obviously less religiously observant than we are. My family is modern Orthodox, but who had sort of recognized that the fellow traveling along with hardcore leftism that now requires that you dissociate from your Jewishness. I mean, forget about sympathy for Israel. No, actually, you're getting a Jewishness, because Jewishness is symptomatic of a sort of high earning anti-socialist ideal. Like some of them are realizing, hey, all these people I thought were my friends and I was doing marches with them, actually, they really don't like me very well.
Right.
And so you are seeing some of those people who are coming out of reality.
So, and then what's happening with them? Because there is that wake up call. Yeah, right. And they're not becoming necessarily like Ben Shapiro.
No, I think that they're becoming. I'd say that they're living closer to the world of reality.
Okay.
There are a lot of people in this last election cycle, for example, who normally would have just voted straight line Democrat. And it's not that they voted for President Trump. They bring themselves to vote for President Trump. A lot of them stayed home. A lot of them said, I can't vote for Kamala Harris if she's going to advocate on behalf of.
So you're saying that we won't see that in the data because they didn't.
I mean, I think there are a lot of Jews who stayed home on the Democratic Party side of the aisle. And you did see some fairly significant upticks in, for example, Republican voting, particularly in suburban Florida Orthodox or Pennsylvania also. I mean, so you saw it right around Pennsylvania was a big deal, right? Like it actually made a big difference in Pennsylvania. I mean, this is why when people say, "Oh, the Jewish population, they didn't move." Okay, first of all, as everyone who's Jewish knows, the vast majority of Jews in the United States have no connection with Judaism, have no connection with Israel, have no connection with Jewish practice. They like bagels sometimes.
And as a kid, we would call it Jerry Seinfeld Judaism.
Yeah, although now Jerry Seinfeld is not so he was like, Jersey right now. But there are a bunch of people who sort of pull out their Judaism only to hit you with the, as a Jew, I hate Israel or my synagogue or my rabbi's bad. And that's obnoxious. But, I think that because Jews are geolocated in a particular number of locations in the United States, and most of them aren't in swing states, right? You might see it a little bit in like the suburbs of Detroit, where Michigan turned for President Trump.
Yeah, they're not a huge community,
right? You have feeling size, but example, you have a fairly large Jewish community right around the Pittsburgh area.
Yeah,
in like Squirrel Hill. Like that area of Pennsylvania, you saw some movement there. Or you see huge movement, obviously, and that's also a disproportionately Orthodox population. Like a huge number of Orthodox are moving from the East Coast down to Florida, the Upper East Coast down to Florida, or from California to Florida.
So the question is, I mean, I'm curious if this is like on your radar at all. Like, is something going to happen with this? Being connected to the world, right? Like, most American Jews, right, would vote for. I'm talking before October 7th. Yeah, vote for Bernie Sanders if he was up against Donald Trump,
right?
You know what I'm saying? So like,
I think that there's still what Rush Limbaugh would call toe tag liberals. People who like on the slab will have on their toe tag they were liberals. But I think that there are a lot of, let's say, dyspeptic former Democrats who are looking at the state of the Democratic Party and saying, I'm not sure that there is a lot of this party for me anymore.
So who are the scavengers?
So scavengers are people who wish to rip things down. I break them into a few different categories in the book. I talk about people who are looters, who basically look at other people's resources and think, those resources are my resources. I really should take them. The system is designed to benefit those people. We need to rip down that system. You have people who are what I call lechers, people who look at sort of traditional values and they say, I feel excluded by those traditional values. And, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a churchgoer or a synagogue goer and abide by sort of traditional family values. But there's a difference between not doing that and then saying all those traditional family values are bad, they are patriarchal, they wreck society, and those need to be torn down. Those would be lechers. And then you have barbarians, and people coming from societies that are non-Western who see all of the flaws in their own societies as the fault of the West. And very often barbarians will then sort of import themselves into the West, and they will then rip on the West from the inside. And you see them very often at Columbia University. And, okay, I've at least studies department. Those kind of folks are very prominent.
What other examples are there? Is it immigration to I don't know, of Muslim mass immigration of Muslims to Germany and influencing
Yes, I mean, the destruction of Western Europe by mass migration from people who are coming from outside the civilization and who hate the civilization is a massive threat to that civilization, without a doubt.
for sure. Okay.
I mean, listen, there's certain politicians who I'll call out again that there's certain specific people that I cannot talk about, but Zar Mamdani would be a good example of this sort of mentality at its finest. Somebody who was brought up in absolute wealth and privilege in the United States, got the best of what America had to offer, lives essentially without a job until he's 30, in his early 30s, right? Very social, and then runs directly for mayor of New York and is feted for this, is treated as though he's some sort of political genius.
There's a lot of people are worried about the extreme right in the U.S. and it becoming anti-Israel. And we always hear more about the extremes than they actually exist within society. But should Israel be worried?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Why?
I mean, it's first of all, the vast left in the United States has already been in Israel. There's a part of the right that is extraordinarily conspiratorial in its approach to the world and sees, forget about Israel, sees Jews as a sort of conspiratorial force in the United States, tries to manifest, tries to claim that all the problems in America are the responsibility of a foreign state or Judaism as a religion. And that's a conspiratorial force inside the right. It's, I think, extremely dark, and it is rising because social media.
But a lot of that's divisive. But a lot of them were allies is the right word, but Alexander were connected with us, right? I mean, a lot of these people are within those circles that you are part of, in a sense.
Yes.
And then, so how do they flip?
I mean, how did that happen? So, I mean, we're not first like that. I think that, well, some of them were. I mean, I think someone's left, some of them were. I think that the social media incentive structures right now are truly terrible. So if you go on X, you're going to get a lot more likes and clicks if you are promoting an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic agenda than if you do the opposite. Same thing is true on TikTok.
So is it a financial thing?
Well, I think some of it's financial. I think some of it is that these people tend to believe in a lot of conspiracy theory about how the world works. And virtually every conspiracy theory, at the end of it, unfortunately, is true. Because where all the conspiracy theories go to is, and then who's successful, right? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on,
that was all our problem.
Well, right. So they were good. Well, so the
right, like we used to.
I mean, if you are on the left, then you say there are people in society who have benefited from our systems of power. Who are the people who are well educated and rich? Disproportionately, a lot of Jews are well educated and rich. Therefore, Jews are the bad guy. And you see a sort of horseshoe argument that's happening from the right, where the idea is that there are a lot of very wealthy, powerful, rich people in American society who are Jewish, and therefore they're in control of all the things I don't like. No, never mind that that's actually not even statistically true. The vast majority of powerful bankers in the United States are not Jewish. The vast majority of people in Hollywood are not only not Jewish, they're also not pro-Israel. And forget about any of that. The important thing is the conspiracy itself, and that's being promoted, unfortunately, day and night by a certain contingent inside the right, and it's growing because conspiratorialism right now is an incredibly sexy pitch. Particularly for young people who are being told that the problems in their own life are not their fault and they can be solved by sort of externalizing those problems onto a different group. So yes, I mean, I'm worried about it. I think it's a real problem, and I don't think it's relegated only to the left.